Hello, and thank you very much for joining me today for yet another presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series, and as always, sponsored by Tamron. So a quick shout out to Tamron. I'm very grateful to them for making this webinar series possible, and I'm extremely grateful to you for joining me today for this presentation. Many of you I know, you probably already get my Ask Tim Gray emails. Thank you for letting me into your inbox each and every weekday morning with a question and answer related to photography. And of course, many of the topics lately have been related to Lightroom Classic. And as part of that, we had a recent webinar, in fact, that was a question and answer session focused on whatever questions everyone had about Lightroom Classic. And of course, there were many questions, many great questions, but it reminded me that there are some topics that I haven't really talked about as far as configuring Lightroom, and I wanted to address those today. So here we are. So thanks for joining me, and we're going to dive right in to some tips for using Lightroom Classic, configuring Lightroom Classic, and a lot of this is just aimed really at making your workflow a little more streamlined, at making it a little bit easier, more comfortable to work in Lightroom. And I find that so many photographers just launch Lightroom and they leave Lightroom set essentially however it was. They don't really change much in terms of the overall workspace, for example. And I think in many cases, they're just maybe not aware of some of the changes or how some of the adjustments might benefit their overall workflow. And so the first tip, this is actually it's a small little thing, and many of the tips I'm going to share today really are relatively small, relatively modest in terms of the effect, but I do find that they can make a big difference. And, one of the things I find is with computers, with software, very often there's distractions. You get a pop-up, some sort of alert, and, whatever the case might be. And I like to have focused time in Lightroom. When I'm in Lightroom, I want to really focus on my images, on my workflow, on what I'm doing. And so I want nothing but Lightroom. And so you can see here, for example, that I have Lightroom and nothing else. In fact, not even a menu bar. And that's because of the full screen mode option. My menu bar is actually available if I go up to the top bar. If I just drag my mouse up to the top of the interface, try to just push it up against the top of the display essentially, then the menu will pop into view and I can see all the various options that are available. One of those options is the ability to cycle through a variety of different full screen modes. And so many of you perhaps are working with Lightroom in an environment such as this, where we have essentially a window that we can drag around. Lightroom living inside of a window, which is somewhat typical. We've gotten accustomed to that in our operating systems, both Windows and Macintosh. But we can also have Lightroom operate in a full screen mode, where it's not a window, it's taking up the entire screen so that you don't have any other distractions around you, essentially. And you can access that just by pressing Shift and the letter F, as in full screen, on the keyboard. And there's actually 3 modes. And so we have the windowed mode, which is the default, and then Shift F once will take me to full screen mode, but with the menu always visible. Well, I don't feel that I need that menu to always be visible, so I press Shift and the letter F one more time to go into full screen mode with no menu. Of course, the menu is still available, as I mentioned, just by going up to the top of the screen. Now, of course, that relates to the overall interface, but there's more that we can do within the interface itself. And so, for example, if we wanted to work with just a single image, there are several ways we can go about that. And I'm going to show you a couple variations on this, and you can kind of decide for yourself based on your own preferences and your own sort of workflow needs, your own workflow scenarios, what you might want to do. So, for example, sometimes I just want to get a close look at an image. I want to focus on one image. And so I'm in loop view already so that I'm seeing a single image. I still have my film strip, but I could press the letter F on the keyboard. So Shift F was to switch among the various full screen modes. Simply the letter F puts a single image into full screen mode. Now, conceptually, to me, this is really about evaluating a single image. But I could also navigate among my photos. So here's a dark and gloomy interpretation of the same image. I've just pressed the left arrow key to go to the previous image, maybe then the right arrow to go to the next image. In this case, I have a few variations on the same image. I see a longer exposure here, for example, and I can navigate among my photos. The problem with this display, of course, is that I'm not actually getting any context. So if I was trying to review my photos, is this one better than that one? I don't really know what's coming next. And so to me, this full screen with the letter F on the keyboard is really more about, I just want to focus on an image, or I want to show someone the image to get their feedback, and I don't want all the clutter of the Lightroom interface. So that F keyboard shortcut can be very helpful in that respect. But even when you're working, so for example, if I want to review my photos, but I still want to actually have some context, well, there's a couple of keyboard shortcuts. The Tab key on the keyboard will hide the left and right panels, and Shift Tab will hide all of the panels. The problem is that with all of those panels hidden, so if I press Shift Tab and hide all the panels, that's all well and good, but at the same time, I want some context. Why didn't I just go into full screen mode for the image and view only the image instead of a little bit of the interface? Well, part of the reason that I would actually hide all of the panels with the keyboard shortcut, that Shift-Tab keyboard shortcut, is to quickly hide all and then to reveal only those that I want. So let's assume that I'm reviewing my images as part of my initial workflow. I can click on the little tab, little triangle down at the bottom of the screen in order to make the film strip panel visible. So I've hidden all panels and then chosen, in this case, just one panel that I want to bring back. Another scenario, I can go up and hover my mouse over the stub, as it were, for the top panel and switch to the Develop module. And when I'm working in the Develop module, I might similarly want to hide all of my panels, but in this case then reveal only the right panel, where all of my work is being done in terms of optimizing the appearance of this image. And so I think it's helpful to have those keyboard shortcuts in mind so that I can hide or reveal all of the panels. But I think more importantly is to keep in mind that in some cases you might want to have just one, maybe two panels visible and not others. Now there is, by the way, an auto hide feature, so that when I hover my mouse, in fact I'll go ahead and turn on auto hide. Well, we have auto hide and show in this case for the left panel. And so if I hover my mouse over the left side, that little stub for the left panel, it will appear. The panel itself will appear, and I can work on this panel, select a preset, for example. And if I move my mouse away from the panel, it disappears. I actually find that personally to be a little bit distracting, because sometimes I'm just moving my mouse to get it out of the way of the image, and then a panel pops up and I've got to move it way over here. It's a minor issue, but I do find that that can be a little bit distracting. But the key is to keep in mind that we can hide or reveal individual panels, we can hide all and reveal all, and more importantly, in certain contexts, I can hide and reveal certain panels that I want to have available depending on the current task in my workflow. So maybe only the film strip plus the loop view when I'm reviewing images, maybe only the right panel when I'm optimizing an image in the Develop module, and of course there are other examples, other scenarios where you might want a different configuration. In addition, I think it's worth keeping in mind that these panels can be resized. So I'm just going to bring out my left panel here and show you that I can make it bigger or smaller. You can only make it so small. It still needs to be big enough to fit everything that you've got on there, the various adjustment controls, etc. But there are situations where not only do you want to maybe make it smaller, maybe I want those film strip thumbnails to be smaller, so I drag the size of the film strip downward to get smaller thumbnails, or drag it upward to get larger thumbnails, essentially choosing how much real estate I want to let that panel take up. But in the Develop module in particular, I find there's a good reason to make a panel larger, and that is if the panel is very small, the sliders have a relatively short distance, and so a little bit of mouse movement goes a long way. If I enlarge that panel, let's go ahead and hide the left panel because that's how I would typically work here, I can enlarge the right panel in the Develop module, and now my sliders take up a much greater distance, and so a small adjustment represents a much smaller effect on the image. You've got to move rather significantly, and this gives you a little bit more granular control over those adjustments. And so again, just by pointing to the edge of a panel, you can click and drag in order to adjust the size of that panel. Sometimes you want to have as much space for your image, for example, as possible, so you'll want to make panels smaller. In other cases, you might want a little more flexibility as you're working, and so you might want to make those panels a little bit larger. Now, there is another issue that I run into, a point of confusion, and this sort of drives me a little bit crazy sometimes because we have the same visual control, essentially, but it does two very different things. And that is the star ratings in this case. So on the film strip, so you can see down on the film strip here, I have a filter control that includes a star rating, so I can say, hey Lightroom, only show me images that have a star rating of, in this case now, 2 stars or higher. Or I could set that down to 1 star, etc. But then I also have the stars underneath the image on the toolbar, and so I might say, oh, okay, I'm filtered by 2 star, now I want to see the 1 star rated images, and the photo disappears, because this star is to assign a star rating. So the row of 5 stars on the toolbar down below the image preview area, that is assigning a rating to the image, whereas the stars you see on the film strip is applying a filter based on the star rating. And so for that reason, I prefer not to use the stars that you see on the toolbar to assign a star rating. And in fact, as far as I'm concerned, there's a much easier way to assign star ratings in any event. Those are just the numbers on the keyboard. So I can press the number 3 to set a 3-star rating, or 4 for 4-star, 5, etc. And so I can just use those keyboard shortcuts. And so I'd rather these stars not be here at all. It's just confusing, I think. And if I'm clicking for a filter, I might accidentally click on the assigning of a star rating. And so there are a couple things that you could do here. Number one is to press the letter T on the keyboard, as in toolbar, of course, to hide the toolbar. That's all well and good, but sometimes there are controls that you actually want to have access to. So, for example, switching your view modes or rotating an image as needed. And so instead of actually hiding the toolbar altogether, I recommend customizing the controls that actually appear here. And note, by the way, that the specific controls are different in the grid view, which I've accessed here by pressing the letter G on the keyboard, versus the loop view, which you access by pressing the letter E, as in there's an E on the end of loop. So that's our keyboard shortcuts for switching. Over on the far right of the toolbar, there's a little pop-up, and we can choose which specific controls we want to have available on that toolbar. And so, for example, I don't want to have those star ratings there, so I can turn off rating, and you'll see that the star ratings have disappeared. The option to assign a star rating with those star buttons. I can also pick and choose, maybe I want navigation controls or zoom controls. Maybe I want a quick shortcut to the grid overlay. So for example, I'll turn on the zoom option so that we can adjust the zoom size of the image with a control right on the toolbar, as opposed to going to the left panel to the navigator, for example. The point is that we can fine-tune which controls are actually going to appear on that toolbar. And if there's controls, if you ever have clicked on the star rating on the toolbar thinking you were setting a filter, and then were of course disappointed, then you might want to, as I've done here, hide that rating. And yes, I actually have done that on more than one occasion where I'm just kind of in a hurry. I click a star not thinking about which star I'm clicking on or where those stars are, and I've assigned a rating rather than setting a filter for my images. In addition, so I've talked a little bit about the panels. Something that I actually admittedly didn't used to use and now have gotten in the habit more so of using is what's called solo mode. So I used to work with solo mode turned off, and so that I could have all of my controls, all of my various panels, my sections here, so working in the develop module in this particular example, and I can scroll and scroll and scroll and get access to everything. Over time, though, I started to realize I was doing a lot of scrolling, and my pet peeve that caused me to prefer this really wasn't very well justified. And what that is, if I go ahead and right-click on one of the headers, so here's the basic header, for example, I can right-click in the empty space and choose solo mode. Now, only one section will be open at a time. So let's go to split toning because that's a small one. And you can see that as I switch from basic to split toning, when I select split toning, basic closes. When I select basic, split toning closes, etc. The same would hold true for any of those other sections. Only one section of the right panel here will be visible or expanded at any time. The reason that I didn't used to like this is that I got this sort of unpredictable effect. So I go to HSL and then I scroll down here to the bottom and say, oh, actually I want to take a look at split toning. And because split toning becomes the only section, it sort of relocates itself. There's this sort of auto scroll effect, and I found that a bit distracting. And then I realized what's more distracting is having to scroll through all of the various controls. And so I found that I actually now prefer working in that solo mode, which I'm using the develop module, the right panel here in the develop module as an example. You can set this independently for the left and right panels in each module and pick and choose when you want that behavior. So the same sort of concept would apply in other modules within Lightroom as well. In addition, unique to the develop module, and this is a pretty new feature, we can actually make adjustments. So I'm sure many of you are aware that we can actually hide. So if I go into the library module, for example, I can hide some of these sections of the panel. So let's say that I don't really use the keyword list, I just find it distracting or whatever the case might be. I can choose keyword list and keyword list disappears altogether. Thankfully, at any time, I can right-click again and enable it if I realize that I want to have that keyword list. It's actually very helpful. But the point is that we could hide or reveal some of these sections. So if there's a section here that you simply never use, maybe you never use comments because you don't post to social media directly from inside of Lightroom, you could right-click and turn off the comments section. It'll always still be available. You're not getting rid of it permanently, obviously. But point being is that you can hide or reveal those individual sections. Well, that's actually changed in the develop module where we don't have the option to hide or reveal. Instead, there's an option to customize the develop panel. And one of the great things about this is that you can now reorder the sections of the panel. So first off, we can turn things off. Let's say you never use split toning, so I turn off split toning. If I click save, then split toning will disappear, just as we saw a moment ago in the library module, just a different approach, a different interface, if you will, for how we accomplish that. I can also reorder these various controls. And so, for example, I don't tend to use the tone curve very much at all, and so I might drag that down further. So these little sets of 3 lines over on the left-hand side enable you to drag up or down so that you can put things into an order that you find is a bit more appropriate. So maybe, for example, you tend to use the basic controls a lot, and then lens correction and the transformation controls you tend to use a lot, but some of these others you don't use quite as much. You might order these sort of in priority, and then you can click save, and you'll see that if I relaunch, all of these controls will actually be reordered. You'll notice that the control, the split toning that I hid, has hidden, but the order has not updated. It requires a relaunch. I'll go ahead and do that later so we don't have to sit here waiting for Lightroom to launch. But I assure you that that really will adjust the order of those sections. And of course, you may have noticed there's the default order option as well. You can simply click that button to get everything back to the default order. I do actually use split toning from time to time, so I'll re-enable that and save and once again relaunch later. But that gets me, in this case, back to where things were. And I do find that that can be helpful. Now, I've always hesitated with these sort of more dramatic changes to the overall interface in any software, in Lightroom, for example. And part of that, for me personally, because I'm teaching this software so much, I'd rather show you what the software looks like sort of out of the box, other than things that I strongly recommend changing. And so the main issue is now you might have to do a little bit of translation where you're watching one of my videos and now my panels are in a different order than what you have, and you've got to sort of adjust your thinking, or if something's hidden, now you can't get access to it very easily. So it's worth giving some thought to, how important it is to rearrange versus keeping things sort of in their default state. That said, it certainly can be helpful, especially if there's some of these controls that you essentially never really take advantage of. All right, so shifting gears just a little bit, we'll talk about metadata just a little bit. So of course we have a metadata menu that is on the menu bar when we're in the library module. And one of the things that I find, I suppose, sort of humorous, but also a little almost disturbing, is that not every piece of software uses the same definition for color labels. And so actually what I'm going to do here is go to all photographs, and let's, here's some color labels. So I've got some red color labels assigned to images here. And the way that color label works is that it's not really a color, it's a word. And so when you assign a color label, a word is being put into the label field in metadata for the image. And so if we go up to the metadata menu and choose color label set, you'll see that my labels, my color labels, are currently set to the Lightroom default values. That's probably good, but if you had been using Adobe Bridge previously, then you might have assigned color labels in Bridge, and suddenly your color labels don't appear correctly. So I'll switch to Bridge, and you'll see that now my color labels, in fact, let's filter based on a red color label, and you'll see that the images with a red color label don't actually appear with a red color label. Actually, turn off. I've got a filter there set for no color label. So the red color label actually is available because I had used Adobe Bridge as an example in this case. So bear with me. If I switch now to a filter with no color label, with a different color label assigned, you'll see these are the color labels that had been assigned in Adobe Bridge. And so it's a little bit complicated here in Lightroom because I have a mix and match of some images with Bridge color labels and some with Adobe, with Lightroom, I should say. And so let's take a look at the filtering options here. If we look at all of our photos, and then I look at the different color labels that have actually been assigned, with my catalog setup, this obviously is a demo catalog, and so there's all sorts of wacky things established. But I have images with a blue color label, which are not appearing blue, with a green color label, which are not appearing green, with a red color label, which are not appearing red, and with a select color label, which is appearing red. And that's because I've switched to the defaults for Adobe Bridge rather than Lightroom. And in Adobe Bridge, the word for the color label that is red is the word select, which is a little bit silly, obviously. We also have a yellow color label, which doesn't appear yellow. But if I go back and choose the Lightroom color labels, you'll see I still have the same words available in metadata, but now the select color label, which had been red, is now white. This obviously can get very confusing very quickly, and that's because of how those terms are defined. If we go into the Edit option under Metadata Color Label Set, you'll see that the Lightroom default has the name of the color as the value that is added for the color label. And if we had switched to the Bridge default, you can see the words that were used in Adobe Bridge. Why this was ever the case in the first place, I have no idea, but it was. And so if you had been using Adobe Bridge in the past, then you would have had these words as the color labels. And if that's an issue for you, then I would strongly recommend taking a look at my Cleaning Up Your Mess in Lightroom course, which is included in a bundle which I'll mention at the end of today's presentation. But that course includes a lesson on fixing color label mismatches. But the point is that you'll want to make sure to configure these appropriately. I recommend using the Lightroom defaults because it simply makes more sense in terms of the color label being assigned the word that is the color. But if you had been using Adobe Bridge extensively, you might want to use the Bridge defaults or keep the Lightroom defaults, but then go back and change the color labels for those Bridge images so that they all match up. So I'll go ahead and click Change just to make sure that applies. Hopefully that's not all too confusing, except that it is a bit confusing by its nature because we simply have these two different definitions for color labels, one of which relates to colors, one of which relates to completely different words, obviously. Now, another form of metadata, or another way that you might make use of metadata, is to use a preset. And there's various situations. The primary situation where I would use a metadata preset is during import. When I'm importing photos into Lightroom, I would assign certain metadata to the photos. So let's take a look at that feature here. If I go to the metadata menu once again, then I can choose Edit Metadata Presets, and that will bring up my dialog, my Edit Metadata Presets dialog, of course, where I can define a preset. Now here I have some presets already defined. So here's my Tim Gray import preset, for example. And if we go through the various options, any metadata value that has a check mark over on the right side will be updated for the image if I apply this preset. So if I, for example, apply this preset during the import process, then those values that have a check mark will be updated to the actual value shown. So here the color label, the label field, will be updated with the word red. And as many of you may be familiar from both my real-world workflow course in the GreyLearning library, as well as a previous webinar presentation, I'm now using a red color label. I'm assigning a red color label to every image during import so that I know those photos have not yet been reviewed. And then once I get a chance to review the images, mark my favorites with a star rating, etc., then I remove that red color label. So at any time, I can always go back to a folder from a given trip and filter based on red color label and make sure that I actually reviewed all of those photos. And then, of course, since I'm applying a metadata preset during the import process in this particular example, I'll want to be fairly generic. And so, for example, I'm putting my name, my copyright status, maybe my contact information. I could put in my mailing address here, for example, but I wouldn't want to update other details that would not be quite so generic. And so, keywords, for example, I don't want a metadata preset assigned during import because what keywords would I assign to every single photo that I ever capture? Probably not any. They wouldn't be very useful keywords in any event. But the point is that we can define a metadata preset here, pick and choose which information we want to include in the metadata that we're adding to our photos. We then, of course, could save the current settings as a new preset using that pop-up control up at the top of the dialog. And then in the import dialog, I could specify this particular preset as my metadata preset in the Apply During Import section of the right panel within that import dialog. So I find that that is such a quick and easy way to make sure that I'm adding key data. So my copyright information, my contact information, that red color label, as I mentioned, key metadata values that I want to update for every single photo. So marking these photos as being my photos, for example. So, and note all the way also that you could create different presets. So in an environment where maybe you're a wedding photographer and you have a second shooter, but you put all of your images into one Lightroom catalog, you could use one metadata preset for each of those imports, for each of the photographers. So it's, here's the me import metadata preset, and then there's the you import metadata preset, as the case may be. So you can have individual presets for each photographer, for example. So in many cases, I find when I'm leading photo workshops, sometimes we have couples that are joining us, and they both share a Lightroom catalog, so each of those people could use their own preset upon import so that you always knew whose photos were which, even if you're not sure which camera you were using from one shoot to the next. All right, let's switch back to some interface notions here. And there's a couple of settings that are available when we're working with our images and viewing those images. And so, for example, in the loop view, there is actually an information display that we can enable for our images. And so I can press the letter I on the keyboard, as in information, to cycle through from no information, this information, and that information, as the case may be. But we can actually customize what information is being presented. And so if I go up to the View menu, then we have a number of options that relate to the overall view. So right now, I'm in the Loop View display. So when I choose View Options, that will bring up my Library View Options dialog, but I'm automatically set to the Loop View. And you can see, first and foremost, we have the Info Overlay. So I was pressing the letter I on the keyboard to show that Info Overlay. I could also turn on or off the checkbox in this dialog if I wanted to. And you'll recall that there were two sets of information that were presented. And I can actually change that information. So I could switch between Info 1 and Info 2, and you'll notice Info 1 includes the capture date and time, and Info 2 includes, in this case, the shutter speed, the exposure information, essentially. Well, I can pick and choose which of those categories to include, but I can also redefine the category. And so info number 1, for example, we have the file name and the copy name, so the file name on the hard drive, for example. I can also display the capture date and time. That's somewhat useful, I think. I might also want to display other details, so I could put copyright status or the cropped dimensions. There's a wide variety of different options that we can choose from here. And so I can pick and choose which specific info I would like to present. So maybe I want to just have the same information in a different order. I'll choose exposure and ISO. And then for the second option here, I'll use capture date and time. The point is that I can pick and choose what information I want to show versus not show for each of those different options. So let's say, for example, that for the second setup here, I want to use the exposure information first and foremost, and then maybe I'll include the lens setting, and perhaps, let's see if there's something else I might like to include here. We already have the ISO, we already have all the basic settings. Maybe I'll just put the camera model down below, for example. So point being is that I can switch among those various views. So I have 2 sets of info that I can configure. I can configure based on the metadata that I want to include, and then cycle through that information on the images. So I sometimes find that sort of presentation, that information, as being a little bit distracting. At the same time, it does give you quick access to some of those details rather than digging through the metadata or hovering over the image and looking underneath the histogram, depending on how you have things squared away. And notice, by the way, under the loop view settings as well, there's a general section here. There's a checkbox for show message when loading or rendering photos. You may have noticed as I switch between photos, I get a little message saying that it's loading. And I do recommend leaving that option turned on, because I found all too often if the preview for the image is low res, it makes the image look a bit out of focus. And if you don't have a message saying loading, be patient, I'm rendering a full resolution preview, for example, then you might assume that it was actually just an out of focus image and you might delete it. And so this way you know that you're not seeing the high quality version of the image just yet. These other 2 options just relate to video, so we won't worry about that right now. But if I close that dialog, now you can see that I have that letter I on the keyboard, but it now has a little bit of a different setup for the different info 1 versus info 2, and I can just toggle through at any given time. So again, most of that information in this case is already available in the metadata section over on the right side, or in terms of that exposure information and even the focal length, it's right underneath the histogram over on the right panel. But still, from time to time, you may find it helpful to have that additional information presented for your images. And of course, we also have a grid view display. And so if I switch, I could switch to the grid view first, for example, by pressing the letter G on the keyboard, and then from the view menu, once again, choose View Options, and it will take me to the Grid View tab. Because I was already in the Grid View, I can actually just switch back and forth right inside of the dialog, though, if I'd like. And then I can choose which information is going to be displayed with my thumbnails when I'm in the Grid View display. And so we have, for example, whether or not we want to show the grid extras at all. So do you want a more tidy display where it just essentially looks like slide mounts, or do you want to see the extra details of the photo? And this is mostly a matter of personal preference and, sort of your workflow needs. I like having that additional information available for the images in a wide variety of scenarios. But once you've enabled that extras display, you can also choose between compact cells, a smaller version of the thumbnail presentation, or expanded cells, which gives you a little bit of a larger slide mount, as it were, a larger border area around the image. And so with expanded, obviously, there's some additional details that you can display. Let's go ahead and start with just compact so you can get a better sense here of some of these other options. So we can show clickable items. So for example, there's rotation buttons and star rating assignments, etc. There's a variety of additional controls, and you can choose whether you want them to only be displayed when you mouse over an image, or if you want them to be displayed at all times. So if I turn off this checkbox, you can see, for example, here's my rotation buttons at the bottom corners of each thumbnail. So do I want them always there, or turning on the checkbox only when I hover my mouse over that actual image area? And then we've seen previously when I showed you the color labels that there was the tint showing. I had a color label with the outer area around the image being tinted red or green, as the case may be. You can turn that off if you prefer. I like having that on so that I can more easily see when a color label has been assigned, and then you can choose how strong you want that to appear, essentially the opacity setting for the color. And then the image info tooltips, I actually generally prefer to turn this off because I find it incredibly distracting. As I'm moving my mouse around the image, I get a little banner that shows me the file name and other details about the photo. You might like having that information display. I personally prefer to turn it off. Within the cell itself, so the cell would be the area around the thumbnail for the image, we can choose whether we want to see flags, which are the pick and reject flags, the thumbnail badges, and those are these icons that you see down here at the bottom right of the thumbnail. So in this case, I have that push pin, which indicates there's GPS data for this image. It's in a collection, I've cropped it, I've applied adjustments to it, etc. So you can just see some status information there. Whether or not there's unsaved metadata, so we'll talk about a setting that relates to that a little bit later, but you can see an indication for that if you prefer, if you turn this checkbox on. And then quick collection markers. Do you want to see if the image is currently included in the quick collection? And then if we're in the compact cell setup, which we are, you can see up at the top we have the compact cells option selected. We can pick and choose among these settings. So do you want to see an index number? That would be the number, the sequence. Now this number is not the file name for the image. It's just based on the current number of images that are being displayed. Which one is this? So right now, I'm browsing all photographs, and this sample catalog in Lightroom has just over 3,600 images, almost 3,700 images. I'm displaying all of them, and so you can see that index number relates to that number of images. If I switch to a different folder in this case, you can see the index number has changed to reflect how many images are currently being displayed. So this image is currently, well, it's actually a video, but it's number 20. If I select two folders to display, I can click on one and hold the Shift key and click on another. Now that number, that index number, has changed to 38. And so it's just a reference to which number out of the current sequence is that image currently. So that might not be the most useful information. In any event, knowing what it means is important, and you can choose whether or not you want to see it. And then we have the rotation controls, and then a top and bottom label. So this is similar to that info display in the loop view. We can pick and choose what information we actually want to display above the image and which information we want to display below the image. So here I'm showing the file name as well as the star ratings and color labels. And then if we switch to the expanded cell view, then these additional options apply. And so I can see a header and a footer. So I can see, for example, the color label control and the rotation buttons on the footer. I can also pick and choose at this header what information. There are up to 4 pieces of information I can display. There's the index number, which we just talked about, crop dimensions, the file name essentially, the file name extension. And so, for example, you might pick and choose among some other details. Maybe you want exposure and ISO to be displayed for the images, for example. So whatever the case may be in terms of your personal preferences for the information to display with your photos. So having covered those basic displays, there's also some preferences that I want to cover here. And in fact, I'm going to take a look first at catalog settings, essentially because I sort of consider that to be maybe a little bit more important, because the catalog relates to so much of the information about your photos. So keep in mind that with Lightroom, and this is one of the things that many photographers have struggled with in terms of understanding how Lightroom operates, with Lightroom, your photos are separate from your catalog. And so you need to back up your photos. Let's say they're on an external hard drive. You might use, for example, I recommend GoodSync as a synchronization backup tool, so you can synchronize from your primary hard drive to your backup hard drive so that you're backing up your photos. In addition, though, you want to back up the information about your photos, and that would be the catalog. And so by default, I have the backup set to once a week. So if it's been a week since I last backed up, Lightroom will say, hey, it's time to back up. Whenever I quit Lightroom, it'll tell me it's been more than a week. Do you want to make the backup right now? And I generally would say, yes, indeed, I definitely want to do that. I also, let's say that I'm backing up weekly, but I've been doing a lot of work with my images and I want to back up a little bit more quickly, you might say. Then I could also choose to back up when Lightroom next exits. So I can choose a frequency, monthly, weekly, daily, or every single time I quit. But then there's this outlier option, so my setting will remain at weekly. I'm just saying I also want to back up. In addition to that weekly schedule, I want to back up the next time Lightroom exits. The setting when I come back will still be at weekly. Point being, it's a good idea to back up your Lightroom catalog so that you're helping to ensure that you're preserving the information about your images. I'll talk about another option for that in just a moment, but keep in mind that the other option I'm going to share with you does not eliminate the need to actually back up your Lightroom catalog. Still something that I strongly recommend doing on a regular basis. While we're talking actually about some of these interface settings, Bob's got a question here about a second display. So he's got a second display and he wants to control what's on that second display. There's actually not a huge amount of flexibility as it relates to that second display. Obviously, in the context here of a webinar presentation, I'm not able to actually show you two displays at a time per se, but down at the bottom left of Lightroom, at the top left of the film strip panel, you'll see buttons 1 and 2 for the different displays, and I can click on my second display, and that would bring up my display on the second window, but I don't have a whole lot of control. It's not a second instance of Lightroom. I'm just able to switch between the grid view, the loop view, a compare view, survey view, or slideshow view, and then I can choose whether or not I want to lock. So, for example, lock on a single image on my second display while I switch among the various controls on my primary display, for example. And so if I right-click, you can see what those various options are, but that would appear as a secondary display. All right, so getting back to, well, actually, let's take a look, see what we've got in the way of other questions here to make sure we cover as many of these as possible. Great question from Gigi about getting photos to a phone. And so just a quick little mention of that synchronization feature. I know I've talked about that in previous webinars, but when we have folders, of course, that we're managing, so I have folders on my hard drive that contain various images, but then I also have some collections. And so I have some photos from Italy, and I have photos from a different trip to Italy, or, well, actually that one's an empty one. But I have, some favorite photos from Asia, as the case may be. Well, I can also enable synchronization, and that's what I recommend getting the photos. There's essentially two ways that we can get photos to your smartphone, either synchronizing through the facilities of your phone. So, for example, if you're using an iPhone, you would use iTunes to synchronize folders of images to your phone, and they would appear as albums there. But we can also enable synchronization with Lightroom Classic. So in this case, I'm not using synchronization on this particular computer, with this catalog, I should say. And so if I click on the identity plate, you'll see the synchronization feature, and I could start. At the moment, it's turned off because I'm using synchronization with my primary catalog, not this demonstration catalog. But if I start that synchronization, I could then turn on the checkbox to the left of any of my normal collections here, and those would be synchronized to the cloud and therefore be readily available inside the Lightroom mobile app on your smartphone, on your Android phone or your iPhone, for example. All right, so getting back to those catalog settings. So once again, from the Lightroom menu on Macintosh, Edit menu on Windows, we can choose Catalog Settings. I mentioned that backup. On the File Handling tab, nothing too terribly critical here. We can adjust our preview, both the size and the quality, and for the one-to-one previews, how quickly we want to get rid of them to free up hard drive space. We also have sequence numbers which relate to file naming templates if you're using automated approach to file renaming, so an import number and how many photos have been imported. But then more importantly, on the Metadata tab. Now, many of these options are just a matter of personal preference. So I'm not going to talk about those. I'll just mention a couple that I consider really critical. All of these are covered in more detail in my Configuring Lightroom course in the GreyLearning library, by the way, for those of you interested in more details. But I mentioned backing up your metadata because when you back up your photos, you're not necessarily backing up your metadata because by default, Lightroom puts all of your metadata updates only into the catalog, not out to the photos. However, you can turn on this automatically write changes into XMP checkbox, not the most clearly named control, but what this means is that as you make changes to the metadata for your photos inside of Lightroom, that information, most likely or possibly, will also be automatically written out to the actual source image. So into the JPEG or the DNG in those cases, if it is a proprietary raw capture, so an NEF file for a Nikon shooter or maybe a CR2 for a Canon shooter, for example, Lightroom will not write the metadata into the actual source image. It will instead create an XMP sidecar file and then update that file with the metadata. The caveat is that this only relates essentially to what you can think of as standard metadata. So things like star ratings and keywords, that will be included, that will be preserved as part of the photos themselves or the sidecar file. But some of the Lightroom specific features, so pick and reject flags, for example, will not be written to the metadata even with this checkbox turned on. Membership in collections, virtual copies, there's a variety of these specific things. History in the develop module, these specific features inside of Lightroom which will not be written because there's nowhere essentially for it to go. Well, in theory it could, but Lightroom doesn't do that. In addition, I like to turn on this option down below. If I were ever going to admit that I forgot to change the time zone on my camera, then of course I would want to update the capture time for my images, and my preference is to also update the capture time for the files themselves. In other words, to kind of destroy the evidence, as it were. Keep in mind that this option to write date or time changes into those proprietary raw capture files, it does also require that the automatically write changes into XMP checkbox be turned on in order for that to be done automatically. So if you turn on the date or time checkbox but don't turn on automatically write changes, that information won't be written automatically. You'd have to manually save that metadata. Great question. So I mentioned backing up, and Fred asks a sort of clarifying question here. If he's backing up with GoodSync, is his Lightroom catalog file also, is the catalog itself also being backed up? And the answer is it depends. It depends on where your Lightroom catalog is. If you're using GoodSync, assuming that your photos are on an external hard drive, then you're synchronizing your external Photos hard drive to your Photos backup hard drive. And your Lightroom catalog presumably is not on that external hard drive. If the Lightroom catalog is only on your internal hard drive, then a synchronization from one external to another external obviously won't include the catalog as part of that backup. One handy trick for that, though, is to configure your backup to go to your external hard drive that contains your photos. Make a folder for those catalog backups, and then when you're prompted to create a backup, simply change the backup folder. Instead of being in the same folder as your catalog, which is a little bit silly, change it to the external hard drive that contains your photos, and now every time you're backing up your photos, you're also backing up the latest backup copies of your catalog. All right, so that covers the key things that I think are important within the catalog settings dialog. Do note, by the way, that the catalog settings relate to the catalog. I know that's obvious, it's self-evident. However, that also means if you're working with multiple catalogs and you want to change the setting for all catalogs, you need to open each catalog individually and adjust catalog settings individually for each of those catalogs. Right now, I'm only changing the settings for the catalog that I'm currently working with. If I go open up a different catalog, any of the changes I've made here will not have been applied. With Preferences, however, which again is on the Lightroom menu on Macintosh, Edit menu on Windows, Preferences are Lightroom-wide. So if you're working with multiple catalogs, the preferences relate to Lightroom regardless of which catalog you're actually using. And so, for example, we have a variety of different preferences, and many of these, I'm not going to talk about all of these, certainly, because many of them are just a matter of personal preference. But there's a couple things here that I think can be very handy. And one of those is the default catalog. So by default, Lightroom, when you launch Lightroom directly, it will open with whatever catalog you had most recently been working with. Well, what happens if you open up a backup catalog to make sure it's in good shape, then you quit, then you launch Lightroom thinking that you're going back to your normal catalog? In fact, you've opened up a backup catalog, and I've seen more than a few photographers create a very serious mess by opening up a backup catalog and then having that become essentially their default catalog, and now their information is all over the place and their workflow is a bit scrambled. So rather than loading the most recent, one of the things you can do is to specify which particular catalog you want to open always whenever you launch Lightroom. So if I go double click on an LR-CAT file, that opens Lightroom with that catalog, but then when I quit and launch Lightroom again, instead of opening whichever random catalog that might have been, possibly a backup catalog, it could always bring up, in this case, this is my sample catalog, for example, my demo catalog. And so I can make sure that Lightroom always brings up that catalog to help avoid confusion. And so if you have multiple catalogs or if you've got backup catalogs, I think it's a very good idea to tell Lightroom specifically which catalog you want it to open every single time by default. You could always go to the menu and choose a different catalog to open, but the point is that to avoid confusion, good idea to make sure that you've selected a specific catalog rather than load the most recent catalog. Now, in my case, I have a demo catalog. I have a catalog that I use for my own images, so I need to switch back and forth, so I generally don't assign a specific catalog in that context, but I most certainly could choose a specific catalog to open each time I launch Lightroom. And then some import options I think handy to be aware of. I prefer to have the first checkbox here turned off. When I insert a memory card or connect my smartphone via USB, I don't want the import dialog to pop up automatically because it doesn't always mean that I'm about to import photos into Lightroom. So I prefer to have that option turned off. If you don't have that scenario where you plug in your phone, for example, then of course you could just leave this checkbox turned on. The previous import or the current import, I prefer to have this option enabled. So if I'm importing photos, I want to be taken automatically to just those photos. However, if I'm importing photos while I'm browsing another another folder, I don't want Lightroom to switch me to this other collection. I want to stay where I'm at. So you might prefer to turn that checkbox turned off. The camera-generated folder names I wouldn't worry about. In our context, it's a kind of a special case. And then the replacing previews, I would generally not worry about that option for reasons we don't need to get into. It starts to get a little complicated there. I'm assuming we're generating standard previews or one-to-one previews typically. But this JPEG option can be an issue if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG, which I actually don't recommend because you're importing your RAWs. Lightroom will create a JPEG preview, so you don't need your JPEG captures as part of a RAW plus JPEG in the context of Lightroom. But if for some reason you want to have the RAW and the JPEG, Lightroom will not import the JPEG that is associated with the RAW. In other words, the same capture, just the RAW versus the JPEG version with the same file name, unless you turn on this checkbox to treat JPEG files as separate photos. So if you capture in RAW mode and then another day you shoot in JPEG mode, that's no problem. But if you're shooting RAW plus JPEG and you actually want to import both of those images, the RAW and the JPEG, then you'll need to turn on this checkbox for treating those JPEGs as separate photos. I think it's also probably a good idea to mention performance settings here, at least quickly, before we run out of time today. First and foremost, if you get any odd behaviors in Lightroom, something just doesn't seem right, the display looks wrong, you're not seeing previews, whatever the case might be, try turning off the Use Graphics Processor checkbox. Graphics display, the drivers for those displays are notoriously buggy, and so they can create all sorts of issues. And Lightroom is increasingly making use of the graphics processor to improve overall performance. So I highly recommend having this checkbox turned on in order to improve performance. Just note that if you run into some problems, there's a very good chance that turning this off will resolve any of those odd issues. And then caching, if you've got lots and lots of hard drive space available, then you can increase the cache size so that you'll have a faster ability to review images that you return to from time to time. Video cache is a little bit less critical, and I know many of us are not really dealing all that much with video inside of Lightroom in any event. All right, so I've covered the key settings here. I do want to address some questions before we run out of time for the day. And let's see here. So Mark asked about advice for settings to improve performance in Lightroom. And so the graphics card is one of the most significant ones, and that will continue to be significant as Adobe continues to update Lightroom, among other applications, Photoshop, etc., to make more use of the display adapter for performance. Again, this can create some issues, but as long as it's working properly, then it's wonderful. And another option that you might consider, especially if you're using a camera that has a tremendous resolution, very large number of megapixels, use smart previews instead of originals for image editing. This can greatly improve performance. The image quality degrades a little bit. It's not usually a significant issue, but if you generate smart previews for your photos, those are going to be at a lower resolution than a super high resolution camera. So you would render those smart previews, for example, at import, and then turn on this checkbox so that those previews will be used instead of your originals in the develop module, which will speed up that work. And I'm sure many of you have noticed from time to time that there will be some odd issues as it relates to working with your images, things hanging up, performance delays, slow slider movement, etc. So there's been some issues in the develop module, and this can certainly help to improve that. And then I'm going to take a look at a couple of these additional questions. I mentioned some of those view options. Also note that on the interface tab of the preferences dialog, there are some controls that relate to the film strip. So I talked about the grid view display and the various controls that we can enable, the information displays that we can enable for that grid view. There's also some similar options for the film strip that you can look at here on the interface tab of the preferences dialog. So David asks, if I work with two displays, and will Lightroom allow you to put your main image on one screen and the sliders on the other? And so I actually almost never work with multiple displays in Lightroom, and that's simply because I'm almost never home, and my primary computer is a laptop. I'm almost always on the road, so I don't very often have a second display available. When I am home, it's an option, but I don't tend to make use of it just because I've gotten so in the habit of working with a single display. But yes, what you could do is have on your second display, ideally your larger and better quality display, you could have what essentially amounts to, you might say, is the loop view of the image, and then you could have the develop module on another display. So you don't have, in Photoshop, you can have panels that are floating around and you can move them from one display to the other. In Lightroom, we don't have that capability. We can resize and, in the develop module, rearrange and even hide some of those panels, but we can't move them from one display to another the way you could in Photoshop, the way you still can in Photoshop. But you could have on your secondary display, you could have the develop module essentially with all of those various controls on the right panel, and then you could use the loop view display essentially on your second, whichever display looks better, essentially your higher quality display, or whichever one you prefer, so that you have a reference view on one image that is updating based on the changes. So it is possible. I would say that the multiple monitors display features in Lightroom are somewhat limited, in large part just because we don't have that flexibility within the interface itself. Okay, so yeah, Janie, just a quick reference to my color label little technique. So I apply a color label on import, and in this case using them as purple, but then she's finding that the Lightroom Classic is not filtering based on the label. So purple, it sounds like you might have that mismatch. If you're filtering by purple and not finding purple, what I would suggest first and foremost, if you have any odd issues related to color labels, then go to the library filter bar, the metadata tab, and set one of the pop-ups to label. And I'll go, in fact, to all photographs so you can see all of those labels again. And then you can see all of the individual labels that are anywhere, even if they don't match. So for example, that select option that we saw previously, which is an Adobe Bridge red color label, but in Lightroom, the word select is not associated with red. So you can see all of those labels here, and that'll make it easier to kind of troubleshoot and figure out what's going on. Yeah. So Sam is essentially saying what I was just talking about. It sure would be nice if you could save a configuration, a workspace inside of Lightroom, and then give it a name so that, here's my image review workspace and here's my image editing workspace. There are so many things that I would love to update about the Lightroom interface to make it a little bit more streamlined, a little easier, more flexible to work with. So Adobe, if you're listening, come talk to me and let's make some changes to the interface so that we do have more flexibility. But no, as I mentioned, you don't have the option to create a workspace and then save it the way you can in Adobe Bridge and in Adobe Lightroom. That functionality is not yet available in Adobe, I mentioned Lightroom. In Adobe Bridge, it's available. In Adobe Photoshop, it's available. But in Adobe Lightroom, it is not available. I sure hope at some point we'll get what will amount admittedly to a rather major redesign of the overall interface, but there's so many things that I think could be done to help streamline that workflow. That said, I certainly hope that today's presentation has helped you in terms of getting Lightroom a little bit more configured to your liking, streamlining your workflow, helping you work a little bit more efficiently. Those tips are everything I've talked about today is really aimed at helping you get the most out of Lightroom in your own workflow. And speaking of making the most of Lightroom in your workflow, as many of you know, I publish a tremendous number of video training courses that are in the GreyLearning library. And to thank you for joining me today, you can get $20 off the Mastering Lightroom Classic bundle. There's a bundle of courses that cover understanding Lightroom, configuring Lightroom, organizing with Lightroom, optimizing with Lightroom, a wide variety of courses to help you really make the most of your workflow using Lightroom Classic as the foundation of that workflow. And you can get the whole bundle, including updates as they are published at no additional cost. So $20 off the $99 price, that makes it just $99. You can point your web browser at timgray.me/web79, as in webinar special, $79 price. That'll redirect you to the site with the coupon applied automatically so you can get that full bundle. So thank you once again for joining me today. I've had great fun sharing these tips. I hope you find these tips useful and that you share this webinar presentation once we get it published to YouTube. Share it with your friends. Subscribe to me, the Tim Gray TV channel on YouTube, so that you'll get the latest updates as we publish additional videos, webinar recordings, etc. And perhaps more importantly, if you're not already on my email list for the Ask Tim Gray email newsletter, I'd certainly encourage you, if you don't mind an extra email each weekday morning. There's lots of great information, I believe, in there. But we'll also send a follow-up email, those of you that have joined us live, so that you'll have access to the recording and you'll get notified for the next presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series sponsored by Tamron. Once again, thanks to Tamron for making this possible. Thank you for joining me, and I'll look forward to having you join me again for a future presentation as part of the GreyLearning webinar series. Thanks very much.